The small town of Woodville had always been a place where things moved at a steady pace. Its residents, familiar with one another, knew each other's stories, their struggles, their joys, and their routines. It was the kind of place where everyone said hello as you passed them on the street, where neighbors looked out for each other, and where the local diner's coffee always seemed to taste just right. For Deputy Sam Roberts, it was home, a place where he had spent his entire life, serving as a law enforcement officer for nearly 2 decades. That Tuesday morning, however, felt different. The sun had barely crested over the horizon when Sam set out in his patrol car, the routine hum of his vehicle mingling with the soft chirping of birds in the background. He had always enjoyed the calm of early mornings, the stillness before the world came to life, allowing him to think through the events of the day, preparing himself for whatever might come his way. It was this calm, this sense of predictability, that kept him grounded in his job. After all, being a deputy meant being ready for anything. On this particular morning, Sam was tasked with monitoring the town park. There had been reports of some teens gathering there regularly, loitering, causing a minor disruption here and there. Nothing too serious, but enough to catch the attention of the local authorities. Woodville was small, and these things didn't go unnoticed. Sam knew many of these kids by name. In fact, he had seen some of them grow up. But there was one thing he had never been able to understand, the trend of sagging pants. It seemed like every young man in town, including the 3 troublemakers Sam had been hearing about, wore their pants far too low. It was a fashion trend that Sam couldn't quite grasp. As he cruised into the park's parking lot, he spotted them immediately. Zach, Kyle, and Josh, the trio of teens who had been causing the most ruckus. They were standing near the entrance, laughing loudly, with their pants hanging around their thighs, making it impossible for them to walk without shuffling. Zach, the leader of the group, was the most defiant of the bunch, always looking for trouble. He was tall, with a cocky attitude that seemed to fuel his bravado. Kyle and Josh were quieter, though no less rebellious. They followed Zach's lead, trying to mimic his swagger. Sam had been down this road before. The cycle was all too familiar. Kids pushing boundaries, trying to make a statement, all while disregarding the respect that he believed everyone should have for each other. Sam had no issue with teenagers being teenagers, but he drew the line when that rebellion started affecting the harmony of the town. He parked his patrol car across the lot, taking a deep breath. There was no reason to rush into this. It wasn't a high-stakes situation, yet. He could already hear the faint sound of music coming from the teens' direction, the bass thumping loudly, echoing across the otherwise quiet park. Sam rolled down his window, letting the cool breeze sweep in, and observed them for a moment longer. Zach noticed the patrol car immediately, his eyes locking onto Sam's with a look of challenge. Zach was never one to back down from an encounter, and he seemed to get a kick out of pushing people's buttons. Sam had dealt with his kind before, but there was something about Zach that felt different, a sense of urgency building, something Sam couldn't quite put his finger on. As he turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, Sam could hear the murmurs of the group. He kept his distance for now, hoping that Zach and his friends might calm down on their own. But they didn't. The teens started walking toward him, Zach leading the charge with a smirk on his face. "Hey, deputy!" Zach called out, his voice loud and mocking. "You here to give us another lecture?" Sam remained calm, offering a slight smile. He'd been a cop long enough to know how to handle people like Zach. "Just checking on you boys, making sure you're not disturbing the peace," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. Zach laughed, clearly unimpressed. "Peace? This is the park. We're not hurting anyone. Besides, you know, it's our right to wear what we want." His words were full of defiance, his pants sagging lower as he spoke, as if to prove his point even further. Sam could see the other 2 teens behind Zach, looking uncomfortable but not daring to speak up. They shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another as if weighing their options. I'm not here to tell you how to dress, Sam said, his voice still even, though there was a sharpness to it. But when you're causing a scene, disturbing others who come here to enjoy the quiet, that's when we have a problem. Zach rolled his eyes, clearly uninterested in what Sam had to say. Disturbing others? Come on, man, you're overreacting. We're just having fun. Sam's patience began to wear thin. He had been trying to give the boys the benefit of the doubt, but he couldn't ignore the fact that this behavior was becoming more frequent. He had dealt with situations like this countless times before, kids who thought they were invincible, who believed they could get away with anything as long as they didn't directly hurt anyone. But Sam knew better. This wasn't just about pants or music, this was about respect, respect for themselves, respect for others, and respect for the community that had given them so much. I'm not overreacting, Zach, Sam said, his voice firming. You're out here, acting like this in front of everyone. You're setting an example, whether you realize it or not. There's a time and place for everything. And this, Sam gestured to the group, this isn't the place. Zach's expression shifted, a flash of irritation crossing his face. What, you gonna arrest us? For what, wearing pants? Get real. Sam didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Zach's. He knew this confrontation could escalate quickly, but he also knew that sometimes, taking a stand, showing these kids that their actions had consequences, was the only way to reach them. Sam wasn't interested in arresting them or ruining their lives, he just wanted them to understand that their choices mattered. I'm not going to arrest you for your pants, Zach, Sam said, his voice quiet but intense. But I'll tell you this, if you keep pushing the boundaries, if you keep acting like you're above the rules, it won't end well. Zach let out a scoff, turning to his friends. See? Told you. He's just another old guy telling us what to do. Who cares about the rules? We're not breaking the law. Sam shook his head, taking a slow, deliberate step back. He wasn't going to win this argument with words alone. But there was something else he could do. Something that might actually make a difference. Without warning, Sam turned and walked back to his patrol car, leaving the teens to follow. He didn't say another word, but the tension in the air was palpable. Zach and the others exchanged confused glances, but they didn't move to stop him. Sam opened the trunk of the patrol car, retrieved his radio, and made a call. He wasn't sure if they would get the point immediately, but he had a plan to make sure they would. As he spoke into the radio, Zach and his friends stood in the parking lot, eyes trained on him, trying to figure out what he was up to. Whatever Sam had planned, they knew one thing for sure, it wasn't going to be anything like what they had expected. The wheels of change had already begun to turn, and neither Sam nor the teens knew it yet, but this encounter would be the start of something that would shake the town to its core. The tension was thick, and all it took was one small decision to turn the ordinary into the extraordinary. As Sam walked back toward his patrol car, he could feel the eyes of the teens on him, the weight of their confused stares pressing into his back. He was aware of every step, the tension between them thickening with each passing second. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of his car's trunk as he retrieved his radio, his mind racing through the steps of what he was about to do. He wasn't just going to talk this through, he needed to show them the consequences of their actions, in a way they wouldn't expect. The radio crackled to life, and Sam's voice came through clear and steady. Dispatch, this is Deputy Roberts. I need a unit here at the park, stat. Bring the backup. We've got a situation with some teens. They're not taking this seriously. He paused for a moment, scanning the park from the corner of his eye. The sounds of the world around him seemed to quiet as he spoke, his voice sharp and deliberate. We need to make a point. As he waited for the reply, Sam felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle in his chest. He wasn't just a lawman in this town, he was a figure of authority, someone people looked to for guidance. He had been with the Woodville Sheriff's Department long enough to know that sometimes, the job required more than just enforcing the law, it required instilling respect, teaching lessons the hard way when necessary. He wasn't there to ruin the kids' lives, but he had to make them understand that actions had consequences. And in this case, their carefree defiance wasn't something that could simply be ignored. Meanwhile, the teens were huddled together, whispering among themselves, throwing sideways glances toward Sam as he spoke into the radio. Zach, the leader of the group, was the first to break the silence. He folded his arms across his chest, a smug look plastered across his face as he spoke to his friends. "What's the deputy gonna do, huh? Callin' back up like it's some kind of emergency? This is ridiculous. It's just pants." But Kyle, who had been quiet until now, looked uneasy. "Dude, I don't know. Sam's not playing around. He's serious. I've seen him like this before." Josh, the youngest of the group, nervously tugged at the waistband of his sagging pants, a clear sign of discomfort, though he was too embarrassed to speak up. He didn't want to be the odd one out, the one who backed down, but the atmosphere had shifted. It no longer felt like just a rebellious act, it felt like it was about to become something bigger. As the radio crackled again, Sam's calm, collected voice came through the static. "Backup is on the way," he said. "You boys have two choices. You can either stay right where you are and wait for the consequences, or you can walk away and come back when you've thought things through. I'll leave it up to you." Zach scoffed, but his cocky smirk faltered for a brief moment as he exchanged a look with his friends. His bravado was beginning to wane, the uncertainty in the air palpable. For the first time, the teenager realized that this wasn't some simple scolding, it was something that could change everything. "Man, what's your problem?" Zach said, trying to recover his cool. "It's not like we're doing anything wrong. We're just—" "You're not listening," Sam interrupted, his tone firm and direct. "This is about respect. For the park, for the people around you, and for yourselves. You're not here to make a statement, you're here to hang out and enjoy the day. And as long as you're making a scene, I'm going to make sure you understand why that's not acceptable." The tension that had been building between them finally broke when the sound of an approaching siren pierced the air. The sound of a second patrol car grew louder, echoing across the quiet park as it pulled into the lot. The engine of the second vehicle came to a stop, and Sam turned to face the arrival of Officer Jenkins, a colleague from the Sheriff's Department. Jenkins stepped out of his cruiser, scanning the scene with a professional but empathetic gaze. He nodded at Sam as he approached. "What's going on here, Sam?" Officer Jenkins asked, his voice a steady contrast to the chaos that had just been bubbling up. Sam glanced at the teens before turning his attention back to Jenkins. "We've got a couple of kids who think they're above the rules. I'm about to teach them the hard lesson they don't seem to want to learn," Sam explained, keeping his voice low. Jenkins, a man who had been working in Woodville for just as long as Sam, knew what that meant. They had seen this before. Jenkins looked at the teens, taking in their defiant expressions. "All right, let's show them how the system works," he said. "No more games." With a nod from Sam, the two officers turned toward the teens, their footsteps deliberate and unhurried. As they walked over, the group of boys shuffled uneasily. Zach, still the leader, tried to act tough, but his voice was beginning to crack. "Are you really gonna arrest us for pants?" he asked, trying to regain control of the situation, but the words lacked their usual confidence. "No one's getting arrested," Sam said firmly. "Not yet. But you will have to deal with the consequences of your actions." By now, a small crowd had gathered on the outskirts of the park, drawn in by the sirens and the commotion. Some watched from their parked cars, others stood in small groups, whispering to each other. Sam could see the concerned looks of parents, teachers, and residents who were curious to see how this would play out. Woodville wasn't used to this kind of drama, it was a quiet town where everyone knew everyone else's business. When something like this happened, it was bound to leave an impact. "I'm giving you one last chance," Sam continued, his voice carrying. "You either pull up your pants and show respect, or we're going to escalate this. I don't want to do that, but you've left me no choice." Zach glanced around, the weight of the situation sinking in. He didn't want to look weak in front of his friends, but he could feel the pressure mounting. He wasn't sure what Sam was planning, but he knew he wasn't going to be able to talk his way out of this one. "Fine," Zach muttered under his breath. "We'll pull them up. Happy now?" But Sam's expression didn't change. "You're not just doing this because I told you to. You're doing it because you've learned something today. You're showing everyone here that respect is more important than your pride. Now, do the right thing." The three teens exchanged uneasy glances, but they slowly, reluctantly, began to pull their pants up. It wasn't the easy defeat that Sam had expected. There was no triumphant moment ere they admitted defeat. Instead, there was an uncomfortable silence that fell over the group. Sam watched them, his gaze steady but not judgmental. He wasn't looking to break them down, he was simply hoping to show them the value of standing tall, figuratively and literally. As the teens adjusted their clothing, Sam noticed something shift. There was no longer the usual defiance in Zach's eyes. There was an unspoken understanding. He didn't speak again, but his posture had changed. He wasn't slouching anymore. Kyle and Josh, too, were standing straighter, their earlier cocky attitudes diminished. With a sigh, Sam turned back to Officer Jenkins. "We've made our point. Let's give them space to learn." As the officers turned and walked back toward their patrol cars, the teens lingered for a moment longer. They hadn't been arrested, they hadn't been humiliated, they had simply been forced to reflect on their actions. For the first time, they understood that their choices had consequences, that rebellion without cause was more than just an act of defiance. It was a waste of potential. The silence was broken by the sound of a voice from the crowd. A parent, one of the onlookers, spoke up. "You did good, Sam. These kids needed to hear that." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Sam turned to face the crowd, his eyes meeting the grateful expressions of the residents who had witnessed the moment. They knew the importance of what had just transpired, not just for the teens, but for the whole community. As the teens slowly walked away from the park, their heads held a little higher than before, Sam's eyes followed them. He wasn't sure if they had truly learned their lesson. But in that moment, he knew that they had at least been given the opportunity to change. And that, in itself, was a victory. The days that followed the confrontation at the park were quiet, but the ripple effects of that afternoon would soon be felt throughout Woodville. Sam found himself reflecting on the moment more than he'd expected. The faces of the teens, Zach, Kyle, and Josh, kept coming back to him, particularly the way they stood after pulling up their pants, their body language shifting from defiance to reluctant acceptance. He knew the lesson wasn't over for them, but he wondered if it had been enough to spark real change. The local diner, a small but popular spot for the town's residents, became the first place where the whispers about the incident began. Woodville wasn't a place where big events happened often, and when something did, people talked about it. Some praised Sam for stepping in and teaching the kids a valuable lesson, while others questioned whether it was too harsh. A few older residents, who had seen similar confrontations in their younger years, couldn't help but chuckle at how quickly things had escalated, while others felt a sense of pride in Sam for standing firm. As Sam sat down for his usual lunch at the diner, he overheard snippets of conversation that made him realize just how far-reaching the incident had been. He'd expected the teens to forget about it after a few days, but it was becoming clear that the lesson he had tried to teach was resonating in ways he hadn't anticipated. The old-timers at the counter were discussing the event with a kind of reverence, as if it were some great turning point. They weren't wrong to feel that way, Sam thought to himself. the balance of respect and authority had always been delicate in small towns like Woodville. Across the room, a group of teachers from the local high school were gathered around a table. They were talking animatedly, and Sam recognized a few of them. Mrs. Dillard, the English teacher, caught his eye and waved him over. "Sam, come sit with us. We've been talking about what happened the other day," she said with a smile, pulling up an empty chair. Sam hesitated for a moment but then shrugged and made his way over. "Sure. Hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all," Mrs. Dillard replied, motioning to the rest of the table. "In fact, we were just saying how impressed we were with how you handled that situation at the park. A lot of the students are still talking about it." That was something Sam hadn't expected. The teens, especially the ones who had witnessed the altercation, were still talking about it. It made him uneasy, and yet, a small part of him was glad to hear it. He'd wanted to make an impact, but he hadn't expected the ripple effect to go this far. "I just did what needed to be done," Sam said, trying to downplay the praise. He wasn't one to bask in attention, especially when it came to doing his job. "You've been teaching these kids more than just the law," Mrs. Dillard said, leaning in. "You've been teaching them about consequences, about respect. And it's something a lot of them haven't really been exposed to before. Especially the ones who think they can get away with anything." That hit a nerve with Sam. He knew all too well that there were kids in Woodville who had grown up thinking the rules didn't apply to them. Kids who came from broken homes, who had never learned the importance of accountability. And yet, here he was, in the middle of a town that had always prided itself on its sense of community, trying to right those wrongs. "I hope it sticks," Sam replied, his voice quieter now. "But I'm not sure it's enough. They need more than just a lesson in respect. They need someone to show them a better path." Mrs. Dillard nodded. "That's true. But sometimes, a moment like that is enough to plant the seed. A lot of these kids don't have the right role models. Maybe you were the one to give them something to think about." It was hard for Sam to believe that he was the one who had made the difference. Sure, he was the law, and people often looked to him for guidance, but he hadn't ever thought of himself as someone who could change a teenager's life. He was just doing his job, enforcing the rules. Yet, as he thought back to that afternoon at the park, he realized that the lesson he delivered wasn't just about authority. It was about showing these kids that there was another way, a way to live that demanded respect, not just from others, but from themselves. Later that afternoon, Sam received a call from the local high school. It wasn't unusual for him to get calls from school administrators or faculty, especially when there were issues with students. But this call was different. It was from Principal Harrison, who had asked to meet with him in person. Sam made his way to the school after his lunch break, wondering what this was about. When he walked into the principal's office, Harrison stood up and shook his hand. "Deputy Roberts, thank you for coming," Harrison said, motioning for him to sit. "I wanted to talk to you about the situation with those kids at the park." "I was wondering if I'd be hearing from you," Sam said, taking a seat. "I'm sure word spread fast about what happened." "That's an understatement," Harrison said, a dry chuckle escaping his lips. "But more importantly, I wanted to ask you something. Do you think they learned their lesson?" Sam didn't hesitate. "I do. But I don't think the story ends there." "You're right," Harrison said, leaning forward. "That's why I'm reaching out. I want to bring you in to talk to the student body. We've been having some issues with kids being disrespectful, acting out, especially the ones who think they're invincible. I think it would do them good to hear from you." Sam's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You want me to speak to the whole school?" Harrison nodded. "Yes. I think they need to hear your side of things. You're a figure of authority, but you're also a part of this community. And you can teach them something they won't get in the classroom." Sam sat back in his chair, the idea catching him off guard. Public speaking wasn't his thing, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. This wasn't just about one group of kids at the park. This was about reaching a wider audience and showing them the importance of respect, accountability, and understanding the consequences of their actions. "I'll do it," Sam said, finally making up his mind. "But I want it to be real. I'm not here to lecture them. I want them to understand." "That's exactly what I had in mind," Harrison said with a smile. "We'll schedule it for next week. I'll make sure the students know what to expect." Over the next few days, Sam prepared for his speech, and as the date approached, he found himself feeling more and more nervous. He wasn't sure what he expected from the students, but he knew he had to be honest. This wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about making them see something they hadn't seen before, something that could change their perspective on life. When the day finally arrived, Sam stood in front of the student body, feeling the weight of the moment. The gymnasium was packed with students, some eager to hear what he had to say, others skeptical, unsure if anything could break through their indifference. He started with a story, the one from the park. He told them about the teens he had encountered, their defiance, and how he had stepped in to make a point. But he didn't stop there. He talked about his own upbringing, about the lessons he had learned from his family, his mentors, and his experiences as a deputy. He spoke about the importance of respect, not just for others, but for themselves. He explained that they didn't have to be perfect, but they needed to understand that their choices had consequences. Sam saw the students' faces change as he spoke. Some looked uncomfortable, others thoughtful, but it didn't matter. He was getting through to them, bit by bit. As he finished his speech, he asked one final question: "What kind of people do you want to be? The kind who take shortcuts or the kind who stand tall, own their actions, and earn respect?" The gymnasium fell silent. Then, slowly, a few students began to clap, followed by a wave of applause that spread through the crowd. Sam didn't know if this was the start of something bigger, but he knew that for at least a few students, something had clicked. As he left the school that day, he felt a sense of pride that he hadn't expected. It wasn't about the applause. It was about knowing that he had made a difference. And maybe, just maybe, the next time those teens, Zach, Kyle, and Josh, pulled on their pants, they would think twice about how they wore them. The weeks following Sam's speech at the school were quiet in some ways, yet the community continued to buzz with the aftereffects of that day. Sam wasn't sure if it was just the nature of small towns or if the event truly had made a lasting impression, but he began to notice subtle changes in the way people interacted with one another. Teenagers who used to swagger around with a sense of entitlement and rebellion now seemed a bit more subdued. They walked with a sense of awareness, as though the weight of their actions was no longer invisible. Sam couldn't help but feel a mixture of satisfaction and unease as he saw the changes. He had done something important, no doubt about it, but it also raised new questions. Was this a temporary shift, or would it last? One afternoon, as Sam sat on his porch enjoying the rare quiet moment after a busy morning, he spotted Zach and Kyle walking down the street together. They were deep in conversation, heads down, hands shoved into their pockets. Sam didn't want to eavesdrop but found himself watching them from behind his cup of coffee. When they passed by his house, something unexpected happened. Zach, the one who had been the most defiant during the park confrontation, turned to Kyle and said something that caught Sam off guard. "You know, I've been thinking about what the deputy said," Zach remarked, his voice lower than usual. "Maybe he was right. About the respect thing. I don't know. It just hit different." Kyle, who had always been more of a follower than a leader, nodded slowly. "Yeah, I've thought about it too. My dad's been on me about my attitude for a while. I guess it's time I listened." Sam's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to hear that kind of admission, especially from Zach, who had been so determined to challenge authority just weeks ago. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He wasn't sure if it would lead to a complete transformation in the boys, but he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe the seeds had been planted after all. The next few days were filled with the usual routine of patrols, paperwork, and the occasional minor dispute. Nothing extraordinary seemed to happen, until one evening, when Sam received an unexpected call. A frantic voice on the other end of the line told him there had been an incident involving a group of teenagers. At first, Sam assumed it was another run-in with the law. But as the details unfolded, it became clear that this time, things were different. When Sam arrived at the scene, his eyes immediately went to the small crowd of people gathered near the corner of Oak Street. He recognized a few faces, including Zach and Kyle, both looking shaken. As he approached, the scene began to take shape. There had been a fight, but it wasn't just any fight, it was a fight between two groups of teenagers, and it had escalated quickly. What shocked Sam the most was that the altercation hadn't been over something trivial like a schoolyard argument or a petty disagreement. No, this had been something far more serious, a fight that had erupted over respect. Zach stood at the center of the group, his hands held up as if trying to mediate the situation. His face was bruised, and his shirt was torn, but his eyes held a determined glint, something Sam hadn't seen before. Kyle, standing beside him, was breathing heavily, his face pale. Both boys looked like they had just come from the middle of a battlefield, but it wasn't physical violence that had caused the confrontation. It was the same issue Sam had addressed at the park and again at the school, a lack of respect. The other group of teens, clearly on edge, was led by another kid Sam recognized, Jason. Jason was a known troublemaker in Woodville, someone who had been in and out of trouble with the law since he was young. Sam had crossed paths with him a few times before, and it was clear that he didn't take well to authority. He was the type of kid who didn't care much for rules, let alone respecting others. "You want to talk about respect?" Jason spat, his words sharp as he glared at Zach. "I don't think you know what it means." Zach stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. "I know what respect is. I've been learning, actually. Something you could stand to do too." Sam could sense the tension hanging in the air, thick and oppressive. The crowd was growing, a mix of bystanders and students from both sides. He could hear murmurs of disbelief and uncertainty. They were all waiting for something to happen, something that would tip the scales one way or the other. Stepping forward, Sam called out, his voice commanding attention. "Enough," he said. The single word was enough to quiet the murmuring crowd, and everyone turned to face him. The usual bravado that these kids displayed when they thought they were in control was nowhere to be found now. Sam could see fear and uncertainty in their eyes. "This isn't the way to handle things," Sam continued. "You're all better than this." Jason sneered, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you to tell us what to do?" "I'm someone who's been where you are," Sam said, his voice steady but firm. "And I'm telling you right now, this isn't the way forward." Jason opened his mouth to respond, but Sam cut him off before he could say another word. "I get it," Sam said, "you've been told that respect is something you demand, that you can take it by force, or with intimidation. But the truth is, respect is something you earn. You don't get to just walk around like you own the place, treating people however you want. It doesn't work like that." Zach and Kyle exchanged a quick glance, and then Zach spoke up, his voice strong and clear. "He's right. I didn't get it before, but I do now. I've been acting like a fool, like I'm entitled to something just because I think I am. But that's not respect. That's arrogance." The words coming out of Zach's mouth seemed to stun Jason and the other kids around him. They weren't used to hearing one of their own speak this way, least of all Zach, who had once been their ringleader. There was a moment of silence, and for the first time, it seemed like the teens in the crowd were actually listening. Sam took the opportunity to speak again, his voice carrying the weight of his words. "This isn't about me, and it isn't about you, either. It's about everyone in this town. We all have a responsibility to each other. Respect isn't about winning or losing, it's about being human. If we can't get that right, then we're no better than animals fighting for scraps." The crowd remained still, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the air had been cleared. Sam knew that the fight wasn't over, that true change didn't happen overnight. But something had shifted. There had been a small victory, a crack in the armor of the arrogance that had dominated the lives of these teens for so long. The group began to disperse slowly, with Zach and Kyle trailing behind the others, their faces serious but thoughtful. Sam watched them go, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The incident had been more than just a fight, it had been a turning point, not just for Zach, Kyle, and the others involved, but for the entire town. As Sam returned to his patrol car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was just the beginning. The battle for respect wasn't something that could be won in a single encounter, but it was a battle worth fighting. For the first time, Sam felt that there was hope for Woodville, that the community might be able to find a way forward, a way where everyone respected each other, not out of fear, but out of understanding. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the town, Sam couldn't help but reflect on the words he had spoken earlier. Maybe it wasn't about changing the world or fixing everything in one go. Maybe it was about starting small, one person at a time. One lesson, one moment of clarity at a time. He drove down the familiar roads of Woodville, wondering how much further they could go. As the weeks passed, the ripple effect from the confrontation on Oak Street began to slowly reshape Woodville in ways Sam never expected. What had initially felt like a singular moment of tension and potential violence had, over time, transformed into something far more meaningful, something that had sparked conversations in living rooms, classrooms, and the streets. People began to talk. They began to listen. They began to change. For Sam, though, the change wasn't something that could be measured immediately. He could still hear the occasional arguments or see the remnants of the same stubbornness in some of the teens he passed during his patrols. But there was a shift, albeit subtle, in the way people interacted with each other. It wasn't as hostile, as abrasive. There was a kind of undercurrent of thoughtfulness that hadn't been there before, and it was clear that something had started to stick. Zach and Kyle had, in a way, become symbols of that change. They weren't perfect, far from it, but they were trying. Both had come to terms with the fact that respect wasn't something they could demand from others, it had to be earned, given, and most importantly, reciprocated. It wasn't an easy realization, and it wasn't something either of them had fully grasped overnight. But Sam saw them make small efforts every day, whether it was offering a hand to someone who needed help, or speaking out when they saw disrespect being directed at someone else. One late afternoon, Sam found himself walking into the small local diner, a place he'd frequented for years. He needed a quick coffee before his shift, nothing more. But as he entered, he noticed something unusual. Zach and Kyle were sitting in a booth in the back, talking with two younger kids from school, kids Sam didn't recognize at first. They were laughing, chatting, and from where Sam stood, it looked like they were having a genuine, open conversation. The atmosphere around them was unlike anything Sam had seen before. There was no arrogance, no bravado, just a group of young people engaged in what seemed to be a productive, respectful dialogue. As Sam walked in, one of the younger kids looked up and smiled at him. "Hey, Deputy," the kid said, his voice casual but friendly. "Zach and Kyle were just telling us how you helped them see things differently. They said you made them realize they weren't living up to their potential." Sam wasn't sure if he was more surprised by the recognition or the fact that Zach and Kyle were sitting there, clearly taking responsibility for their past actions. A small chuckle escaped him as he approached the counter. "Well, I wouldn't go as far as to say I changed their lives," he said, trying to downplay it. "But it's good to see you all getting along." Zach caught Sam's eye and gave him a small but sincere nod. "We're trying," he said, his tone more grounded than Sam had ever heard. "I mean, it's not easy, but we're trying to get it right." Sam smiled and took a seat at the counter, feeling a sense of pride wash over him. He had no idea what the future held for these kids, or for Woodville as a whole, but in that moment, he knew that the seeds had been planted. And sometimes, that was enough. Change didn't always come in dramatic, sweeping waves. Sometimes, it came quietly, in the form of small acts, of kids trying to be better, to do better. But even as things seemed to improve, Sam couldn't help but feel a nagging worry in the back of his mind. Was this change sustainable? Was it real, or was it just a temporary shift brought on by a single event? And if it was real, how would it affect the community in the long term? As the town continued to buzz with subtle shifts, Sam found himself faced with another unexpected challenge, a challenge that would test the very values that had begun to take root in Woodville. It came in the form of an old acquaintance, a man named Ray Matthews, who had lived in Woodville for years but had always stayed on the outskirts of the community. Ray was a loner, known for his tough demeanor and a reputation that wasn't exactly clean. He had a history of trouble, and though Sam had always kept an eye on him, he never imagined that Ray would be the catalyst for another crisis. Ray had recently returned to Woodville after a stint in prison, and his return hadn't gone unnoticed. The tension was palpable. Rumors spread like wildfire through town, with people talking behind closed doors, speculating about Ray's intentions. Was he here to lay low and turn his life around, or was he back to stir up old trouble? It was one of those quiet evenings when Sam's phone rang with an unsettling call. There had been an altercation at the local gas station, a fight between Ray and one of the town's teenagers. Sam's heart sank as he heard the details. It wasn't just a fight, it was about respect. Ray had been confronted by a group of teens who were making fun of his appearance, mocking him for being an outsider. Sam knew Ray well enough to understand that it didn't take much to set him off. And set off, he was. Sam arrived at the gas station to find the scene chaotic. A crowd had gathered, but the confrontation had already ended. Ray was standing near his truck, his fists clenched, his face as stone-cold as ever. The teen who had been involved in the altercation was nowhere to be seen, but the air was thick with the aftermath. The gas station attendant, a nervous-looking middle-aged man, was trying to calm Ray down. "I'm not looking for trouble, Ray," the attendant was saying, his voice shaking slightly. "You've been through enough. Just leave it be." Ray shot the man a look that could freeze anyone in their tracks. "I don't take that from anyone." Sam nodded, understanding the frustration but also knowing the consequences of letting anger control the situation. "Ray, we talked about this. You can't let your past control your present. You've got a chance to turn things around. Don't let it slip away." Ray scoffed, his eyes hard. "You think I care about what these kids think? You think I care about your lessons? I've been through hell and back, Sam. I don't owe anyone an apology." The words stung, but Sam didn't let them get to him. "Maybe you don't owe them an apology, Ray," he said quietly. "But you owe yourself one." Ray's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Sam wasn't sure how this would end. But then, Ray's expression softened, just a fraction. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Sam could see it, a crack in the armor. Ray was struggling, but somewhere beneath that tough exterior, he still wanted to do better. "I'll think about it," Ray muttered, turning away and walking back to his truck. Sam watched him go, his heart heavy. This wasn't the kind of transformation that could happen overnight, and Sam knew that. But he also knew that change was possible, even for someone like Ray Matthews. He just had to be willing to take the first step. As the night wore on, Sam couldn't help but reflect on the town's progress. It hadn't been easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but there was hope. Hope that people could change, that they could rise above their mistakes, and that respect, once earned, could transform a community. Maybe that was the real lesson that had been learned, that no one was beyond redemption, and everyone, no matter their past, deserved a chance to make things right. As the months passed, the changes in Woodville were becoming increasingly evident, yet they were still subtle enough that they could easily be overlooked. The town had always been a quiet place, where gossip was the loudest form of communication and where people didn't often challenge the status quo. But that old rhythm was beginning to fade, and Sam could sense it as he walked through the streets during his daily patrols. There was a new energy in the air, one that spoke of quiet transformations, of slowly shifting mindsets. It was an early spring morning when Sam received the call that would bring everything full circle. It was about Ray Matthews. Sam had heard little from Ray in recent months, aside from the occasional sighting of him in town, always walking with his head down, keeping to himself. Ray had stayed away from trouble, and Sam had silently hoped that this new chapter of his life would stick. But the call that came that morning wasn't about Ray being a troublemaker, it was the opposite. Ray had been involved in a car accident on the outskirts of town. It was a minor fender bender, but Ray was shaken up. Sam didn't hesitate. He knew the roads out there, the stretch of highway where the accident had occurred, was notorious for being poorly lit and prone to accidents. It was the kind of place where people went unnoticed, where things could get out of hand quickly if not handled carefully. When Sam arrived at the scene, he saw Ray's truck by the side of the road, the front bumper slightly dented, steam rising from under the hood. Ray was sitting on the curb, rubbing his forehead, his expression one of frustration rather than pain. Sam stepped out of his patrol car and approached him, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You okay, Ray?" Sam asked, his voice calm but filled with concern. Ray didn't look up at first. He was trying to compose himself, but Sam could see the weight of the situation on his face. "Yeah, I'm fine," Ray muttered, clearly trying to downplay the incident. "Just a stupid mistake. I wasn't paying attention." Sam knelt beside him, looking at the damage. "Accidents happen," he said, offering a rare smile. "But it's good that you're okay. That's what matters." Ray let out a long, weary sigh, his gaze drifting over to the cracked windshield of his truck. "I don't know, Sam. I've been trying to keep my head down, do the right thing, but it feels like everything I do just keeps dragging me back. It's like I can't catch a break." Sam paused, watching the man closely. He'd been in this position before, had seen this same vulnerability in people who tried so hard to change, only to find themselves in the same patterns. Ray wasn't just frustrated about the accident. He was frustrated about everything that had led him to this point, the years of bad decisions, the long road to redemption that seemed so hard to travel. "Ray, no one's saying it's easy," Sam said, his tone firm but compassionate. "You've got a lot of things in your past, but that doesn't mean you're doomed to repeat them. It's a choice. You've already made a choice to try, even if it's hard. And that's worth something." Ray looked up then, his eyes searching Sam's face. There was no anger, no defiance, just a look of weary acceptance. "I know you're right. I've been fighting it for so long, thinking I didn't deserve to be better. Maybe I'm finally starting to get it, but I don't know if it's enough." Sam stood up, glancing around at the empty road. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Just keep making the right choice, one step at a time. You're doing better than you think." There was a long silence, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. Ray stood up as well, looking around at the wreckage of his truck. "I guess I've got a lot to work on," he said quietly. Sam nodded, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "We all do," he replied. "But that doesn't mean you're alone in it." Ray seemed to ponder that for a moment, then slowly, a faint but genuine smile crept across his face. "Thanks, Sam. For not giving up on me." Sam's expression softened, a rare moment of connection passing between them. "It's not about giving up on anyone, Ray. It's about helping people see what they can become, even if they don't see it themselves." As Sam helped Ray make arrangements for the truck, something inside him shifted. He realized that this wasn't just about Ray anymore. It wasn't just about the kids who had learned lessons from that day with the saggy pants. This was about the community, about how one event, one action, one decision could trigger a cascade of changes that affected everyone. The road to healing, to redemption, to understanding, wasn't paved with grand gestures. It was paved with small moments, conversations, and choices that slowly built upon each other. Later that evening, Sam walked through the town square, taking in the familiar sights. The cafe, the old bookstore, the park where families gathered in the evenings. There was a feeling of calm in the air, something that had been absent in Woodville for a long time. People were talking more, engaging with each other in a way that hadn't been common before. The conversations were different now, not just small talk, but real discussions about respect, responsibility, and second chances. As Sam watched people interact, he couldn't help but think about how far they had come. The town wasn't perfect, far from it. There were still struggles, still moments where the old ways threatened to resurface. But something had changed, a collective understanding that people, no matter their past, had the capacity to grow. Zach and Kyle had shown that in their efforts to be better, and now Ray was doing the same, taking the small steps to move forward. And the people of Woodville, though skeptical at times, were beginning to see that these changes were real, that they mattered. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about building something better for the future. As Sam sat down on the bench in the square, watching the evening sky turn shades of purple and orange, he felt a quiet satisfaction. He had seen the worst of people at times, but he had also seen the best. And in Woodville, he was starting to see the best more often than not. Maybe, just maybe, they were all learning something about themselves and each other. Maybe that was the real lesson, the one that would stick. The next day, Sam received a phone call from his supervisor, the one who had initially warned him against getting too involved with the kids on Oak Street, the one who had told him not to waste his time. The voice on the other end was different now, more measured, less dismissive. "You were right, Sam," his supervisor said. "We've been seeing a shift in the town. People are talking more, working together. The kids, they're listening. We've had fewer incidents, less violence. You've done something here. I don't know how you managed it, but you've made a difference." Sam felt a lump form in his throat, but he didn't let it show. "I didn't do it alone," he said quietly. "This town's got a lot of good people. It just needed a reminder of that." And in that moment, Sam knew that Woodville wasn't just a town anymore. It was a community, a place where respect, change, and growth were possible. Where people could learn from each other, could grow together, and could find common ground despite their differences. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And that, Sam thought, was all anyone could ask for. As he walked through the streets, the soft hum of the town around him, he couldn't help but smile. Change was never easy, and it rarely came without setbacks. But in Woodville, it was clear now that the hardest work had been done, the work of believing that things could be better. And that, Sam realized, was the most powerful transformation of all. The end of one story was always the beginning of another, and Sam was beginning to realize that the story of Woodville was far from over. This was only the beginning.